I stood in my driveway, stunned, unable to move, as flames devoured my Ford sedan. Across the street, Sandra Whitmore, the HOA president, stood with her arms crossed, watching with an almost smug satisfaction. "Next time, you'll think twice about refusing to join," she sneered, oblivious to the fact that she had just committed a crime, one that could very well unravel everything she'd built. What she didn't know was that she had just made a critical mistake, one she'd soon regret. She didn't realize that the person she chose to terrorize wasn't just any ordinary homeowner. It was someone who had spent the last 15 years putting criminals behind bars. I had spent 23 years prosecuting organized crime in Chicago. After all that time, all I wanted was peace and quiet, a place to live without the constant hum of city life, without the pressure of criminal enterprises and shady dealings. Oak Estates seemed like the perfect place. Manicured lawns, pristine houses, and that promise of suburban tranquility. Moving in went smoothly, almost too smoothly. Some of the neighbors even brought over welcome baskets. But that's when I first noticed Sandra Whitmore, standing across the street, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning my moving boxes as if they were evidence. The very next morning at exactly 7 a.m., my doorbell rang. There she was, standing on my porch with that unnerving smile, her pearl necklace gleaming against the crisp lines of her blazer. "Welcome to Oak D," she said, her voice sugar-coated, but her eyes cold. "I'm Sandra Whitmore, president of our homeowners association. I brought your membership papers." I took the papers from her and flipped through the 47 pages of restrictions, regulations, and monthly dues that seemed absurdly high for what little they promised in return. "I appreciate the offer," I said, handing the papers back, "but I'll pass." Her smile faltered for just a moment, but then she recovered. "Everyone joins the HOA, Mr. Carter. It's practically mandatory." "Practically isn't the same as legally required," I replied, maintaining eye contact and holding my ground. Her smile vanished completely, replaced by something colder, darker. "You don't understand. The HOA protects everyone's interest here." I raised an eyebrow. "I'm sure it does, but I'll manage my property my own way, thank you." She didn't say anything more but left, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement as she walked away, but not before she had one last comment. "Oh, and by the way, your mailbox is 3 inches taller than regulations permit. You'll want to fix that." I looked at my mailbox, identical to every other one on the block. It wasn't about the mailbox, it was about control. That night I found the first note on my windshield: conform or leave. The next morning something strange happened. Neighbors who had welcomed me with open arms suddenly started avoiding eye contact. They didn't wave. They didn't stop to chat. It was subtle, but I noticed it. After 23 years in the criminal justice system, I knew exactly what was happening. Intimidation, a subtle campaign designed to make me feel unwelcome. This was no longer just a homeowners association. It was a coordinated effort to push me out. Sandra didn't realize it yet, but she wasn't dealing with just any homeowner. She was dealing with someone who had spent his career taking down criminal organizations. And this, well, this was no different. 3 weeks into my standoff with the HOA, things escalated. The pressure was relentless. Every day brought a new neighbor to my door, rehearsed speeches about community standards and property values. But one afternoon, Bill Henderson, who lived 2 doors down, showed up on my porch. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to be watching. "Look, I'm just trying to help," he said, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "Before you, there were the Thompsons. They didn't join either. Their kids' bikes kept getting vandalized. Their dog mysteriously got sick. They moved within 3 months. I could see where this was going. Fear wrapped in neighborly concern. "What happened to them?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Bill's voice dropped to a whisper. "Sandra runs a tight ship. Things work smoothly when everyone follows the rules. But when they don't, problems happen. Car trouble, permit issues, social isolation." "Sounds organized," I said, leaning in, "almost like a system." He lowered his voice even further. "Sandra has connections at City Hall. She can make life difficult. Just last year, the Millers questioned the assessment fees. The next thing you know, building inspectors show up with a whole list of code violations that never existed before, and no one does anything about it because, Well, what choice do they have? I felt the familiar rush of satisfaction. I knew this game well. How many families has she pushed out? Bill looked around nervously. At least 6 that I know of. That was it. I had the first real piece of evidence. I didn't just have a target. I had a case. Sandra's little HOA operation wasn't just a nuisance. It was a racket, a criminal enterprise. I smiled at Bill. You've just provided the most important information I've gotten since I moved in. You're now protected by something more powerful than Sandra. Evidence. Bill's eyes widened. Federal? I nodded. I'm just a new neighbor who knows exactly how to handle organized intimidation. As Bill left, clearly rattled, I felt a wave of satisfaction. Sandra didn't know it yet, but her little HOA scheme was unraveling, and it was only a matter of time before she paid for it. I began my surveillance the very next day. Cameras went up around my property, some visible as a deterrent, others hidden to capture evidence. The first break came at 3:17 a.m. My phone buzzed with an alert. Motion detected. I checked the screen and saw Sandra, now dressed in black, measuring my grass with a ruler and taking pictures of my mailbox. I didn't confront her. I simply documented everything. Next came counterintelligence. I walked the neighborhood every morning before dawn, photographing similar violations at board members' houses. Jim Baker's fence exceeded height restrictions. Treasurer Helen Porter had unapproved garden gnomes. And Sandra's own porch lights? Yeah, not regulation either. Hypocrisy was rampant, and now I had it all on camera. Then I called in some favors from my old colleagues at the FBI. Background checks on the HOA board members revealed a troubling pattern. Sandra had connections in high places, and her team wasn't just bending the rules. They were breaking them. Helen had been involved in an insurance fraud case that had been quietly settled out of court. 3 other board members had financial irregularities, and I knew from experience that this was no coincidence. I followed the HOA's maintenance worker one afternoon to a storage unit rented under Sandra's maiden name. While he was inside, I placed a tracking device on his vehicle, a trick I'd used countless times on crime syndicates. The next day, I arrived at the storage unit with a warrant, thanks to a judge who owed me a favor. What I found inside was staggering. Meticulously organized files on every resident who had ever questioned Sandra's authority. Personal financial information, photographs and pressure strategies tailored to each family's weaknesses. But the most disturbing section was titled Elimination Successes, a chilling collection of documents, photos, and recordings of families that had been forced out. I could hear their distress in the recordings, and the photos showed moving trucks, taken no doubt by someone who took pleasure in their departure. This wasn't just an HOA, it was a racket, a criminal operation hidden behind the veil of suburban respectability. But Sandra's mistake was simple. She picked the wrong person to target. I continued to gather evidence, each discovery bringing me closer to dismantling her operation completely. But it wasn't just about the evidence. It was about strategy. I had spent years taking down criminal organizations. Now it was time to take down one hiding behind the mask of a homeowners association. I set my sights on a new phase of my operation. This wasn't just about catching Sandra. It was about bringing down the entire criminal enterprise she had carefully constructed, piece by piece. Every interaction, every move I made, was calculated with the precision of a seasoned prosecutor, and it was time to turn the tables. The next step was surveillance. I had already established my hidden cameras around the property, but now I needed more. I knew Sandra would slip up eventually. She was too arrogant, too comfortable in her belief that no one could touch her, and I knew how to exploit that. I began documenting every violation, not just from Sandra's team, but from other board members as well. This was the moment I needed to turn their system against them. I went through the motions, living the quiet life of a suburban homeowner, while quietly building a case. In the mornings, I took my walks, quietly photographing the board members' properties, documenting their violations, and collecting evidence. But nothing compared to what came next. One night, I received an alert from one of my cameras. It was late, well after midnight. I pulled up the footage and saw Sandra in black clothing, walking up to my property again. I watched closely, heart racing with anticipation. She was measuring the length of my grass, taking pictures of my property again, seemingly obsessed with finding some minor infraction. Her actions were systematic, methodical. She was playing by a playbook I knew well, one that I'd spent decades studying and dismantling. Rather than confronting her, I did what I did best. I documented everything. Another piece of evidence to add to the pile. Sandra had no idea what was about to hit her. The next day, I continued my own covert operation. As I walked the neighborhood, I turned my attention to the other members of the board. I noticed small but crucial details: Jim Baker's high fence, Helen Porter's garden gnomes, and Sandra's non-compliant porch lights. Hypocrisy was the key, and I had just unlocked it. The more I gathered, the clearer it became. They were all involved, each of them feeding off the fear they had instilled in this community. I knew it was only a matter of time before I'd have everything I needed to bring them down. I reached out to a former FBI colleague who owed me a favor and requested background checks on all the HOA members. The results came in, and they were as damning as I had hoped. Sandra's past in Florida was filled with questionable decisions, specifically a sealed embezzlement conviction from her previous HOA. That, combined with Helen's involvement in insurance fraud, showed me exactly who I was up against. But I wasn't done yet. I had a few more tricks up my sleeve. I followed one of the HOA's maintenance workers to a storage unit that was rented under Sandra's maiden name. Inside, I placed a tracking device on his vehicle, a tactic I'd used in the past to keep tabs on criminal associates. The next day, I showed up at the storage unit, armed with a warrant from a judge who remembered how I'd helped him years ago. What I found inside was chilling. The unit was packed with files on every resident who had ever stood up to Sandra. Financial records, personal information, and photographs of families who had been forced out of the neighborhood. But what really struck me was the section titled Elimination Successes. It was like flipping through a textbook on how to destroy people's lives. There were photos of moving trucks, some with the families' faces clearly visible, as well as distressing audio recordings. It was systematic, it was deliberate, and it was all done under the guise of protecting the community. But this was no longer about community standards. This was about power, Sandra's power, and her ability to destroy anyone who dared question it. I knew then that I had everything I needed. Sandra had thought she could intimidate and control me, but she had underestimated the person she was dealing with. I wasn't just a homeowner, I was a prosecutor, and I knew exactly how to break down criminal organizations. What Sandra didn't realize was that her little HOA wasn't just a neighborhood watch. It was a racket, a corrupt empire hidden in plain sight, and I was about to expose it for the world to see. Over the next few weeks, I quietly continued to gather more information. I mapped out the entire operation. I followed the money trail, tracing every dollar that flowed from the HOA's funds into Sandra's pockets. I documented everything, making sure that each piece of evidence was securely stored and ready to be used. I wasn't just building a case against her, I was preparing for the endgame. Then came the breakthrough. I intercepted an email that Sandra had sent to the board members discussing their special assessment fund, a slush fund used to pay off their network of enforcers and contractors. The email instructed one of the board members to arrange for my water service to be disrupted as a warning. It was textbook mafia behavior, starting with small inconveniences and escalating to property damage, and eventually violence. But Sandra didn't know that I had been trained to recognize these tactics. I knew how to fight back. As her harassment grew more blatant, so did my resolve. One morning, my water was mysteriously shut off in the middle of a shower. The following day, my mail was delivered mangled or completely disappeared. I even found dead birds arranged on my welcome mat. It was amateur intimidation, but it was effective. It was her message, loud and clear. The worst part wasn't the inconveniences. It was the social isolation. Neighbors crossed the street when they saw me coming. Children were pulled away when I walked by. Invitations to community events stopped. It felt eerily similar to the tactics used by organized crime families to turn communities against their targets. But I didn't flinch. I knew exactly what to do. Sandra and her board continued to tighten their grip, but they had no idea that I was building a case that would bring them all down. The HOA newsletter, printed on expensive glossy paper, began featuring an article about a suspicious resident who was refusing to follow community standards. The article hinted at potential criminal connections. The irony wasn't lost on me. A few days later, I found my garbage cans overturned, with their contents scattered across my lawn, and a $250 citation arrived for a violation that hadn't even occurred. When I appealed it, I was told it couldn't be contested. This was classic racketeering: create the problem, then profit from the solution. But what they didn't count on was me. They didn't realize that the man they were trying to intimidate had spent 20 years prosecuting criminal organizations. And I wasn't just going to sit back and take it. I kept building my case, carefully documenting every violation, every act of harassment. The HOA's grip on Oak Estates was slipping, and I was ready to strike. One day I met Alice Greenberg, an 83-year-old resident who had lived in Oak Estates longer than anyone. Alice had always been overlooked by Sandra's crew, but that was about to change. One morning, Alice was in tears on her porch, clutching an HOA violation notice for an unauthorized wind chime and excessive bird feeders. The fine was $750, almost her entire monthly Social Security check. "They've never bothered me before," Alice sobbed, "but yesterday I waved to you when you walked past. This morning this was taped to my door." I felt the anger rise in me. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone Sandra had hurt, every family she had driven out, every person who had been forced to live in fear. I made a decision then. "What if I told you we could stop Sandra permanently?" I asked Alice. Her expression shifted from despair to determination. "That woman has bullied her last neighbor." And just like that, we had a plan. Alice became my most valuable ally. She opened her home to us, offering it as our operational headquarters. Other neighbors began to join our cause. Neighbors like the Mendes family, whose landscaping business had been sabotaged, and Tom Franklin, whose disability accommodation requests were repeatedly denied. Together, we created a shadow network within Oak Estates. We documented every abuse, every violation. We recorded board members making threats. We tracked the money, following every dollar from inflated HOA dues into Sandra's pockets. Sandra knew something was happening. She could feel the resistance forming, but she couldn't identify it. Her desperation grew, and with it, her mistakes. I knew the time was coming. We had gathered everything we needed. And Sandra, the woman who thought she could destroy me, was about to learn the hard way just how far I would go to protect the people I loved. The moment I had been waiting for arrived sooner than expected. Sandra's campaign of intimidation reached new heights as she pushed harder, making it increasingly obvious that she was desperate. But in her haste, she made a fatal mistake. She underestimated just how far I was willing to go to bring her down. The quarterly HOA meeting was fast approaching. This was Sandra's territory, her stage where she ruled with an iron fist. She used these meetings to control everyone, to maintain that facade of power and control over the residents. It was mandatory for all homeowners to attend, and it was designed to keep everyone in line through subtle threats veiled as community improvement efforts. It was also a perfect opportunity for me to strike. The community center was buzzing with tension as the day arrived. Residents filed in, some with looks of weary resignation, others with clear anxiety in their eyes. I took my seat at the back of the room, trying to blend in, but my mind was focused entirely on the task at hand. Alice, who had become my most trusted ally, gave me a discreet nod across the room. We had set everything up perfectly. The recording devices were hidden, the cameras were on, and we were ready to make our move. Sandra took to the front of the room, projecting an air of authority that only made her more detestable. She had mastered the art of control, and her speeches were as rehearsed as they were threatening. As she started her presentation, I could see the glint in her eyes, a glimmer of satisfaction, like she knew she was in complete control. But that's when I made my move. I stood up calmly and cleared my throat. "Excuse me, Sandra," I said, my voice cutting through the room. All eyes turned to me. "I have a question about line item 6 on page 3 of the financial report. It shows $43,000 for administrative consulting, but there's no breakdown of those services. Can you clarify what exactly this expense covers?" Sandra's smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered, her voice dripping with condescension. "Those are standard operational expenses, Mr. Carter. Nothing out of the ordinary." I shook my head, holding up a copy of the relevant statute. Actually, public disclosure laws require transparency in how funds are spent, especially for money collected under the authority of an HOA. That means every homeowner is entitled to a detailed breakdown of these expenses. So where exactly is that information? A murmur went through the crowd as people began to look at each other, unsure of what was happening. Sandra's composure began to crack. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," she snapped, her voice barely controlled. "I'm just asking for the information I'm entitled to," I replied calmly, keeping my composure. "It seems like there's a lot of money here that doesn't have any explanation behind it, and I'm wondering why that is." A tense silence filled the room. Sandra's smile disappeared completely, replaced by a glare that could freeze fire. "This meeting is adjourned," she said sharply, slamming her papers onto the table and storming out of the room, ordering the board members to stay behind. I stayed, the entire room filled with a quiet anticipation. The tide was turning, and Sandra could feel it. The cracks in her control were showing, but this was only the beginning. The next day, as I sat at home, I received an alert. My surveillance cameras had captured something truly explosive. It was 3:07 a.m. when I heard the shattering of glass. I sprang from my bed, rushing to the window. There, under the harsh glow of the security lights, stood Sandra, standing over my car with a gallon of gasoline in hand. I watched, my heart pounding in my chest as she poured the gasoline over the hood of my car. The pungent smell filled the air, and I knew exactly what she was about to do. She struck a match. The whoosh of the flames igniting was immediate. My heart sank as the fire consumed my car. I quickly activated the emergency recording protocol on my cameras, making sure every detail was captured. Then I called 911. As I watched the fire spread, I knew that Sandra had just sealed her fate. What happened next was nothing short of revealing. Sandra didn't flee the scene. She didn't even seem to care that she had just set my car on fire. Instead, she stepped back, crossed her arms, and watched the flames with an almost sadistic satisfaction. "This is what happens to people who don't understand community standards," she said, her voice carrying across the street. Her words were chilling. She believed without a doubt that she was untouchable. But the fire department arrived quickly, followed by 2 police officers, officers I recognized from Sandra's inner circle, the ones who had always turned a blind eye to her actions. I tried to show them the footage of Sandra starting the fire, but they refused to view it without processing it through the proper channels. They listened to Sandra's practiced alibi, claiming she had been asleep at home. The officers nodded sympathetically, offering the usual comforting words. Sandra lingered behind as they left, approaching me with a sinister smile. "Next time, it might not be just your car," she whispered, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous confidence. "Accidents happen inside homes too." That was the final piece of evidence I needed. She had just incriminated herself in front of multiple witnesses, and I had it all on camera. Sandra didn't know it yet, but her reign of terror was about to end. The next morning, I contacted Jessica Ramirez, my former deputy at the FBI. Within an hour, she called me back. "Mark, this is textbook racketeering, with arson on top of it. We've got jurisdiction. We're going to take her down." The operation was set in motion. Federal warrants were drawn up, and by 6 a.m., a tactical team executed synchronized raids at 7 different locations: the homes of the HOA board members, the HOA office, and Sandra's storage unit. It was all happening so fast, but I stayed out of the way, maintaining my cover as a helpless homeowner while the FBI did their work. When they hit Sandra's house, she was still in her bathrobe, shock on her face as agents breached the door. Her entitlement, her arrogance, all crumbled in that instant. They presented the federal warrants, and she realized, too late, that she had underestimated me. She had targeted the wrong person. The evidence recovered was more than I could have ever hoped for. Sandra's home office contained detailed financial records outlining embezzlement from 3 different homeowners associations. Helen's computer had spreadsheets tracking compliance issues and bribes to local officials. Jim's surveillance logs detailed the harassment of residents who didn't comply. But what really sealed her fate was the discovery of gasoline-soaked clothing in Sandra's garage, hidden behind holiday decorations. The most damning evidence was the binder found in Sandra's storage unit, titled Community Management Techniques. It contained a detailed operation manual, Profiles of every resident who had ever opposed her, complete with their vulnerabilities and ways to apply pressure. There were photographs of moving trucks and calculations on the profits generated when properties were sold under duress. I waited until everything was secured before making my entrance. As FBI agents led Sandra away in handcuffs, I stepped forward, my badge visible. Federal Prosecutor Mark Carter, I introduced myself. Organized Crime Division. Sandra's face went pale as the realization hit her. "This is absurd," she sputtered. "I'm the victim here. This man refused to comply with community standards. Community standards don't typically include arson, extortion, mail fraud, and racketeering." I replied calmly, my voice steady. "We've documented at least 37 federal violations so far." She tried to regain her composure, but it was too late. The weight of her crimes was crushing. "Do you know who I am?" she hissed. "I have connections. This neighborhood needs me." "What this neighborhood needs," I said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, "is justice." And just like that, the curtain fell. The community that had lived in fear for so long was finally free. Sandra was sentenced to 15 years for racketeering, with additional consecutive sentences for arson, mail fraud, and obstruction of justice. The other board members received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. As Sandra was led away in handcuffs, she whispered one last time, "I should have checked who you were before burning your car." I smiled quietly, watching her fade into the background. "Yeah," I said, "you really should have." The courtroom erupted in applause. For the first time in years, Oakey Estates was free from the grip of fear. The first neighborhood meeting after Sandra's conviction took place on my front lawn. No formal invitations, no threats, just neighbors gathering freely, by choice for the first time. Alice, standing beside me, looked around at the crowd. "I don't even know half of you," she said, smiling. "Sandra kept us so isolated from each other." That simple observation became the foundation of a new beginning. We reintroduced ourselves as neighbors, as people, not as mere addresses or property values. We rebuilt the community from the ground up, rooted in respect and mutual support. It wasn't just about taking down a criminal, it was about rediscovering what it meant to live together.